appears to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to talk national security. We're going to talk threats in the gray zone, and we're going to figure out what that means. To help us with that conversation, Elisabeth Braw is with us. Elisabeth, thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me.
So you are a senior fellow at AI. You're the author of The Defender's Dilemma, Identifying and Deterring Gray Zone Aggression. And you've been a journalist in Sweden, reported on Europe for the Christian Science Monitor and Newsweek, and you've been published in The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Times of London, Wall Street Journal, and you went to school in Germany. Where are you from originally?
I'm from the middle of nowhere in the Swedish countryside.
Okay, you're Swedish. And how long have you been in the U.S.?
This is my second stint. So I first came here as an intern in 1996 and then met my husband, who is from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I stayed on. We first lived in Washington, D.C., then in California. Then we moved to London, and now I'm back for my second stint.
Okay. And so, dealing with Russian aggression, I remember hearing that when the Russians do exercises, I'm pretty sure Sweden was a fake target for them. I remember hearing about that when I was in the military. So maybe I wonder, are things like that what sparked your interest in this sort of gray zone warfare? Maybe let's define what that is.
Yeah, so gray zone warfare first. It's aggression below the threshold of armed violence. So if you think about everything that the country or groups operating on behalf of another country, that they can come up with to harm countries such as the US without using military violence. And that's a lot of things they can do, because the only limit is really their imagination.
Right.
And so what sparked my interest was, well, first of all, the fact that this started proliferating, and there used to be just disinformation and cyber attacks, and then we started seeing coercion of Western companies, and we started seeing hostage diplomacy used to get concession from various countries, and we started seeing gradual border alterations. We started seeing boycotts of Western companies, and I sort of thought, well, if you can do this, why would you ever use military violence? And that's where we are today, where countries can do a lot to weaken our societies. And so my interest started, I think, I think I'm probably a little bit older than you, but a child of the Cold War, and there in the middle of nowhere in the Swedish countryside where I lived, there was a military airfield, and so lots of conscripts, and so the Cold War was really part of the daily reality there. And I remember specifically there would be people. They said there were Polish art students. They would come and knock on people's doors, on our door too, and they wanted to sell art. And it was always a little bit odd, because it was obvious that they weren't art students. And even as a child, I realized there was something odd about it. And so that was the grassroots reality of the Cold War on the ground, and I maintained that interest. And now we're seeing more of that again, which has brought me back into the field.
So, I mean, is this a new thing? It doesn't seem like a new thing, right? Using other means besides direct warfare, direct kinetic operations, as we would say. We have broad literature on this in the United States. We call it non-kinetic warfare. It just means we're not blowing you up, we're not shooting you. Is it new, and have our adversaries adapted to it in ways that are we should be worried about?
Yeah, so it's not new. First of all, it's always used in wars, in armed conflicts. There are always these non-kinetic elements, as you said, propaganda and so forth, and efforts to demoralize the population. And the US has used non-kinetic elements too in its various conflicts. But what's new is that these elements are being used in isolation. So without a war going on, they are being used. And not only they are being used against Western countries, including the US. So all of this has sort of snuck up on us. We didn't think that there was anything between war and peace, and now we are in that situation between war and peace, where something is going on, and countries are trying to weaken our countries, including the US, and yet, because it's not military violence, we are not really sure what to do about it.
Is this hybrid warfare, or is that a different thing? I mean, a lot of this is sort of scholarly differences, but trying to break it down for the audience.
Yeah, so hybrid warfare is a combination of kinetic and non-kinetic, so armed violence and what you might call non-violent activities, whereas grey zone activities are just the non-violent ones. And I think, from my perspective, it's really important to not call grey zone aggression hybrid warfare, because then if you go talk to, for example, somebody in my husband's hometown of Grand Rapids, he or she will say, well, what are you talking about, hybrid warfare? I don't see any warfare here. And it feels to them like people like me are just warmongering. Whereas if you talk about grey zone aggression and efforts to subvert daily life, that I think is something that resonates more with people, because it's something that touches on their daily life, and it's not warfare, it's just efforts to harm our society.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's intuitive to people. People know that the Colonial Pipeline was attacked. People know that the Russians invaded Ukraine in sort of a unique way, with the little green men, so-called, where they have this sort of weird sense of deniability that we're not really doing it, but everybody kind of knows you are. Cyber attacks. So, it does seem like people are somewhat awake to it. Maybe tell us what they don't know and what they should be aware of.
So what they should know that is that it's not just the occasional cyber attack like Colonial Pipeline, which was conducted by a criminal gang based in Russia. It wasn't conducted by the Russian government, but clearly tolerated by the Russian government, or otherwise the Russian government would have shut down this criminal gang. So it's not just the occasional cyber attack, it's the constant aggression and the variety that I think people should be concerned about. And in particular, I think what's not being properly understood is how our companies based here in the West, they are on the front lines of all of this. So they can be subjected to coercion by foreign governments, as happened to, for example, Ericsson from my own home country of Sweden. I think people may know that Huawei is a Chinese 5G equipment maker, and many countries, including the US, decided that Huawei was a risk, national security risk, and they decided not to include Huawei in their 5G networks. Sweden did the same thing. And when Sweden did that, Chinese officials, including the Chinese ambassador to Sweden, said, well, Ericsson will suffer the consequences. Now, Ericsson is another 5G company, and it's also a company that has a big market in China. And so that was a threat from Chinese officials. But what can Ericsson do about it? You can't do very much as a company if another country says, well, you'll suffer the consequences. Then a few months later, it became obvious that that wasn't it was just empty words. Ericsson lost market share in China. Everywhere else, its market share went up, or rather, its sales went up, and around the same time, there was a major contract being awarded in China. It got a minuscule share of it, down from a much larger share in the previous round. So that was, I think, a good example of what sort of risks our companies operating globally face.
It seems like Russia and China aren't really limited by these sort of moral standards, these global standards that Western countries self-limit in, and maybe for good reason, since sometimes the entire purpose is to uphold the principles. But are we at a disadvantage here because we can't play by the same rules? And how do we overcome that disadvantage?
So our biggest disadvantage is that we are free and open societies. So anybody can say negative things about our politicians, about our democracy, about the way our society is run. They can also say untrue things, and not very much happens, which makes it extremely easy for other countries to feed disinformation and misinformation into the public domain, and as a result harm our countries. But it's also much easier, for example, to invest in our countries. So if you're a foreign company, you can invest and set up operations very easily in the United States. Yes, CFIUS, so the regulator, the federal regulator, CFIUS, does check for national security risks, but it doesn't block investment and foreign companies basing themselves here on any sort of large scale, because it wants companies to do business in America. And that brings vulnerabilities, because such companies can come in and essentially buy US companies and then take all the intellectual property away and refocus that company's activity on another country, such as China. So that's one risk. And on the opposite end, we have China, where it's very difficult for foreign companies to come and establish themselves without Chinese partners, which means that they have to part with their intellectual property in China. So it's an uneven playing field, and that is a problem. But on the other hand, we wouldn't want to be a country that seals itself, as the US, that seals itself off from the rest of the world, where the government blocks foreign companies just because it doesn't want to part with power. So we are inherently vulnerable, but I think the answer to that is not to sort of try to retreat from globalization and being a free and open society, is to just make everybody aware and help them do their part to limit the risks.
Well, certainly not retreat, but perhaps go on offense in some ways. And maybe that's what we have not figured out as far as a grand strategy goes in the U.S. on how you actually combat, Made in China 2025 and the Belt and Road Initiative, and, to a more regional extent, what the Russians like to do in their periphery. Of course, China seems more global, seems like a much bigger actor that we have to deal with. And they just don't play by any rules, and they have advantages that wherein they can put the muscle of state power behind their efforts. And sometimes those efforts maybe aren't super malevolent. It's just building a port in another country, but this adds to the greater effort of them, sort of taking over the globe and remaking it in their image. And so what are we lacking here as far as, is it will, is it ideas in the U.S.? I mean, if AEI was giving us policy prescriptions here, from a foreign policy perspective, telling Biden what to do here, where should we begin?
I think the most important thing we miss is cohesion between the government and the private sector. And why is that important? So if you think about the private sector during the Cold War, business leaders, they led extremely private companies that had no sort of government ownership at all, but they felt a sense of obligation to the country, and they weren't put under pressure by the government to do particular things, to take particular decisions. They just felt it was their civic duty. Mm-hmm. And I think we have, because we've had 30 years of increasing globalization and borders falling away, we have a generation of business leaders who are not who don't have that thinking, because they've spent their whole careers in a globalizing world where nationalities don't matter, where it doesn't matter where your company is based. And I think the first thing that needs to happen is for the government in the US and elsewhere to educate these business leaders about the fact that nation states are beginning to matter again. Davos world is crumbling, and that they have a responsibility as citizens to do the right thing. Yes, the government can't force them to do the right thing, obviously short of legislating, but I think if they were helped to understand how their companies fit into a broader strategy of keeping the US safe, they would be willing to do their part.
Yeah, we feel like we've been trying that for a while. In the end, companies will do whatever's profitable. And it's really difficult from a policy perspective to figure out, okay, what are the strings you pull to disincentivize overall bad behavior? And it's difficult because it tends to go against basic principles of free market economics. And I just don't know that we've figured it out. And maybe we do need to be more aggressive in that, especially with respect to China. And does this lead into the convenience trap that you write about? Is this sort of in liberal democracies we become more vulnerable because everybody just kind of is moving along, feels like everything's fine, and things are convenient and fat and happy. Is that what's happened?
Yeah, so life is extremely convenient, and it's becoming more convenient by the year or by the month, and it's fantastic to live in a society like this, where you have every service imaginable available around the clock. But because all of this is digitally based, it also makes us more vulnerable. So if a country wanted to wreak havoc on the US, it would. If I were that country, I would bring down various apps. In fact, I would bring down the mobile network or various other bits that power the internet, and it would wreak havoc in daily life, because as we saw with Colonial Pipeline, even just one aspect being taken away will cause people to first panic and then try to look after themselves. And that is, I think, the problem that we have, that if something like this were to happen, and it will happen because so much in our society is based on digital services, if it happens, people don't just say, well, okay, I'm going to be without the internet for a couple of hours, I'll make myself a cup of coffee and read the newspaper. No, they'll panic and make the situation much worse. And so we get this sort of almost complete meltdown because people don't know what to do in a crisis like that. Whereas 30 years ago, obviously it would have meant nothing if there were no internet for a couple of hours, because we didn't use it like that. So what do we do about that? Again, we need to educate the public so that we at least limit the damage of what whoever wishes us ill, the damage that country or group can impose on the country.
I think also Western democracies are just more risk averse. And, I see this in my own past career, where it's just harder to get things approved, whereas the Iranians are doing whatever they want. They have carte blanche because they don't have these things called political blowback and reputations. They don't care. So, you're at a perpetual disadvantage dealing with some of these some of these countries that are just willing to go further than you are. And I think it's a constant policy struggle. Go ahead.
And if I can add, this is a big difference compared to the Cold War as well, which I think is sort of the benchmark that is good to look at. Because during the Cold War, the Soviets, yes, they were ruthless, and the other leaders of countries behind the Iron Curtain, they were ruthless, and they obviously suppressed their own population, but they wanted to be seen as respectable leaders in the international community. So they had that sort of pride in being seen as peers of Western leaders. Whereas if we look at China, Iran, Russia, even Belarus, and of course North Korea, those leaders don't care about their reputation, which means that they have many more opportunities available to them.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Belarus, and we were talking a little bit about that, but before we started recording. So, is that a good example of what we're talking about these days, and this new age of warfare, or gray zone conflict? What is going on in Belarus? I don't think a lot of people know.
It's a fantastic example of gray zone aggression. So what's happening is that in Belarus, it's a an authoritarian country. The president has been in charge for a couple of decades, and there was an election last year that the international community considered to have been rigged, and it imposed sanctions on him after he stayed in power, even after apparently losing this election. So he got mad, and the first thing he did was that he he diverted a commercial flight on Ryanair, which is the European equivalent of Southwest Airlines, something like that. He diverted it on a flight within the European Union and forced it to land in Belarus. And there he had a Belarusian opposition activist detained, and then the plane flew on to its destination. You can't do that. I mean, you can't just sort of take a commercial plane and do with it what you want. So the Europeans then imposed more sanctions on him, and then he got madder still and said, I'm going to flood the EU, so the European Union, I'm going to flood the EU with drugs and migrants, he said in May. And then in June, one of the EU member states neighboring Belarus started discovering that lots of migrants from the Middle East were crossing into their country from Belarus. And so they hastily began building a fence and put soldiers on the border. Then the migrants, new migrants began arriving in another EU member state, NATO member state as well, bordering Belarus. And then, so that was Lithuania and Latvia. And then the migration movement moved to Poland, which is where it is now. And so all these three countries, their borders were being attacked, but not by armed forces, but by migrants. And it's such a clever scheme, because it's completely unclear to the European Union, to NATO, to those countries themselves, what you do in a situation like that. Is it a humanitarian crisis? Is it aggression by another country? How do you respond?
Yeah, didn't Turkey do the same thing with sort of when the Syrian refugee crisis? They would get concessions from the European Union based on how many refugees they would allow through. I mean, is gray zone aggression just another word for politics at this point? Because I mean, it kind of sounds like it is, and we have the same problem at our border right now. I don't know if this is and some people would say that there's a potential centralized somebody funding a lot of these caravans, organizing them to undermine our democracy. Maybe it's not Russia, but geez, maybe it is. I mean, I don't know. It might just be Democrats, but you know, because every when we talk about these tactics, they sound a lot like the BS that I deal with in politics every single day. You know, on a much more micro scale, of course, but in a grander international relations scale, it's just politics, right? Like trying to leverage one another with power dynamics. Oh yeah, If you want to boil it down to one word, that's absolutely true. Because what you can do as a country wishing to increase its power in the world is to come up with these schemes. And yes, it's politics, I guess, because you maneuver vis-a-vis the countries that you're trying to weaken, and as a result strengthen your own standing in the world. And because, again, it's not warfare, it's not armed aggression. Those countries have no idea how to respond. Yeah, that's true. What other examples do you think recently that people should be aware of where this kind of thing is happening, and maybe we have not taken action where we need to? A completely different example is the Chinese construction of islands in the South China Sea. So it started a few years ago with China putting a little bit of material there, and the US and neighbors said, well, you're not supposed to do that because it's not your waters, but the US and the neighbors didn't really respond in any other way, because it would seem a little bit exaggerated and over the top to sort of sail in with, you know, various warships to make the point. And then China put a bit more material there, and so forth. And as we all now know, China now has islands, and there is nothing we can do because it's Chinese territory there. So gradual border changes, I think, is something we should pay attention to. Russia has done it with Georgia, just moving the border, you know, a few meters here and there. It's not enough to respond to with armed forces, but it's not nothing. And another example from a completely different area are Chinese fishing vessels, or ostensible Chinese fishing vessels. They together form something called the Maritime Militia, and it sails around the world and essentially harasses fishermen from other countries or construction crews from other countries, and yet because they are ostensibly fishing vessels, these vessels, there's not really very much you can do without risking escalation. But everybody knows it's just pretense. They're not fishing vessels. How do they? I always wonder. I'm aware of we call them little blue men. This maritime militia that the Chinese have, and I'm always curious how they organize them. You know, are they Are they just paid off? Are they normal fishermen who are paid off by the state and given very clear directions? Are they trained? You know, because it's just not something we would do as Americans, because we care about liability. We care about all of these potential things that could go wrong. And again, this is just a structural disadvantage that we have, if you want to call it a disadvantage. I mean, maybe not making a ton of mistakes is a good thing also. But are you read in on that, on how they actually do that organization?
Yes, it's very clever. So it's not fishermen. It's people whose job it is to be on these vessels, and you can tell that they are not fishermen, because if you look at how many people are in each vessel, it's a much smaller number than would be on a.
So it's Chinese military on fishing boats. Is that, or is it a mix?
Well, it's people sent there by the government. And by the way, what's interesting also is that the boats don't look very much like fishing boats. They are a bit bigger. You can see they are better maintained than your average, creaky fishing vessel that sails around and actually catching fish. But so here's the thing: if you don't mind lying, then you can just keep going, right? So China can keep saying, well, these are fishing vessels, and all the rest of us can say well, we know it's not fishing vessels. We have seen them, and we can tell that they sail information, and they are numbered information and so forth. But if China won't even admit that we have found them out, what can we do? And so it's sort of a crazy game of obfuscation, lies, and very few choices for us.
So, what could we expect with Taiwan, and with the Chinese subversion of Taiwan, is maybe to soften it up, if they have any plans for Taiwan?
That is a really good example. So everybody at the moment, or the people watching Chinese military activities, are extremely concerned about what it could do to Taiwan. But I think you don't actually have to do a lot militarily to weaken another country. So what we're seeing at the moment, for example, is Russian troops arriving at the Ukrainian border in great numbers. So we are looking at about 100,000 Russian soldiers at the Ukrainian border, and investors panicking or getting very nervous. So investors into Ukraine and international money markets getting very nervous about it. And so Ukraine is already suffering, even though Russia has done nothing, because it can have those soldiers at its border, and it's not violating any international treaties or laws. And I think the same thing would be possible with Taiwan. China could engage in a lot of saber rattling that would spook international money markets, investors, and of course insurance markets and so forth, who would then lose confidence in Taiwan because they would fear that an invasion is imminent, and Taiwan would suffer as a result, and the Taiwanese economy. I mean, that is the shining light of Taiwan's achievement, right? So that's what I worry about, that you can do a lot without resorting to an invasion, even by suggesting that you're about to invade.
Yeah, and I wonder what on a different note, I wonder what the Taiwanese will to fight would be. We talk about making Taiwan a porcupine, and thus having the cost be so high that deterrence is achieved with China. But for that deterrence to be real, people have to be willing to die.
Yeah.
And I don't know what our assessment of that is.
Yeah, and let me give you another example of how gray zone aggression, how it affects ordinary citizens. So I don't know how many of your listeners remember the 2014 submarine hunt off the coast of Sweden, but if any of them have,
give us a refresher.
Yeah, so it was 7 years ago now. People in the archipelago off the coast of Stockholm started seeing mysterious movements in the water, and then the Navy was called in because it did look like it might be a submarine. And for those who are interested in naval matters, those of listening know that it's extremely difficult to discover a submarine in an archipelago because the waters are shallow and it's also very poor visibility. The Navy went on a submarine hunt, and inevitably struggled to find the suspected submarine. And while that was happening, Russian media and Russian officials were poking fun at the Swedish effort, essentially saying, are you sure it's a submarine, maybe a Russian submarine, maybe it's a NATO submarine, maybe it's an animal. And then when the Navy found nothing, it obviously seemed to prove that they were just inept. And such efforts, I think, have a lasting effect on the population, because it suggests to the population that their armed forces are no good, and that in case of an armed conflict, there would be no point even trying. And we have seen the same effort by Belarus vis-à-vis Poland and Latvia and Lithuania, where the Belarusian effort or the Belarusian aggression, the point of it was to prove to the world and to the citizens of those countries that their armed forces are no good, that they can't protect their borders. Now, they were able to protect the borders, so Belarus failed, but it's the public's belief in the armed forces in liberal democracies is vital, because if the public doesn't believe that the armed forces can defend the country and that the government more widely can defend the country, then what's the point? And I fear that's an area where China can try to get to the population of Taiwan and suggest to ordinary Taiwanese citizens that don't even try. You're going to lose anyway.
Well, it's a scary world. Scary world out there. People need to know about it and be aware of it, and be clear-headed about it. You would hope that foreign policy would be something Democrats and Republicans could sort of unite on. But I'm unclear what the Biden doctrine will be. Very unclear. Not sure there is one. I think Trump's doctrine was somewhat clear. Definitely not as different as many people give him credit for, I guess. But frankly, I liked it, whatever it was, to be perfectly honest. There was a difference between the rhetoric and the action, but overall, pretty good. I don't know what Biden plans on doing. I don't know what his sense of deterrence is. I don't know. But it's good to be aware of these things. Go ahead.
And we have to remember that deterrence is what happens before an attack or before aggression. If aggression happens, then it means deterrence has failed. So we as the United States have to communicate to Russia, China, whatever the country is that we want to convince. We have to communicate to them now that don't try, because there will be consequences. And not only will there be consequences, even if you succeed, the results will be much more limited than you would hope for. So don't bother. But if you don't communicate that ahead of time, then they'll keep trying and they'll be successful.
Yeah. Well, Elisabeth, thanks for. Would you have something else?
I was going to say, even if there is no Biden doctrine, I wonder if we are seeing a WTA doctrine. So the Women's Tennis Association,
I see, yeah.
Which is at the moment the one entity internationally that's standing up to, in this case, China, and is not deterred by Chinese threats of lost market opportunities.
Right.
And it's, in a sense, the WTA is a pioneer, a totally unlikely pioneer. Who would have thought that a tennis association would take on China? And so I think... And this is an organization that's not just an association. It's also an outfit that has lots of money to lose by standing up to China, but it's doing it. And I think lots of companies and other organizations are watching and saying, well, hang on, they dared. Maybe we can dare to say something too.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's a sad place that we're reliant on courage from individual private citizens and private companies or associations to do that, and that there's got to be a way to give them a little bit more moral backing somehow.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Elisabeth, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course.